What's new? As Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro prepares to seek re-election, the country's socio-economic implosion has become a major problem for its neighbors. Venezuelans are fleeing hunger and poverty by the hundreds of thousands, while disease and crime are spreading across borders. Why did it happen? Lower oil prices, corruption and mismanagement have devastated the economy. A deeply unpopular government, aware that it can no longer win competitive elections, has opted for repression. Attempts to negotiate an agreement between the government and opposition have foundered. Why does it matter? Financial collapse and hyperinflation make Venezuela an economic disaster zone. The crisis is no longer confined to one nation. Refugees and migrants are streaming into neighboring countries. Epidemics and violent crime are spilling over borders, endangering Colombia's fragile peace process in frontier regions. What should be done? The priority is international support for humanitarian assistance along the borders. A negotiated transition is essential to restore representative politics and socio-economic well-being. This requires outside pressure, including threats of targeted sanctions and realistic demands on the Maduro government, from a coalition led by regional governments in the Lima Group. Executive summary: as Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro looks to cement his hold on power, his country is sinking into a trough of misery. Hyperinflation has compounded the scarcity of food and medicines. Epidemics of preventable diseases and a child malnutrition crisis are increasingly deadly. Violent crime has spiked. An estimated 4 million Venezuelans have emigrated, with tens of thousands crossing the border with Colombia each month in search of a new home. Venezuela's neighbors, once bystanders to its domestic tensions, face a catastrophe on their doorsteps. Latin American governments, the UN, European Union and U.S. must redouble efforts to manage the humanitarian crisis, including by ensuring neighboring countries have the resources to cope. They also should lobby, ideally together with China, for renewed government opposition talks aimed at reforms enabling more representative politics and economic recovery. Threatening further sanctions might help push the government toward concessions. The turbulence of 2017 has magnified Venezuela's hardship and the difficulty of finding remedies. While the government has snuffed out months of civil unrest, stripped the opposition-run National Assembly of its power and established a new constituent assembly with authority over all Venezuelan institutions, it has made little effort to ameliorate the country's economic woes. Instead, it claims to be protecting the Venezuelan public against foreign powers and their domestic allies, decrying reports of the very real humanitarian crisis as lies aimed at prompting an imperialist intervention. It is also blocking efforts to provide food and medical aid. The turbulence of 2017 has magnified Venezuela's hardship and the difficulty of finding remedies. The creeping authoritarianism of the latter years of former President Hugo Chávez's rule and the first years under Maduro has metastasized into full-blown partisan exploitation of state and judicial institutions. Information that challenges official accounts is brushed aside. The state publishes neither reliable economic data nor credible health statistics. A full-scale default on the foreign debt appears but a matter of time. Scarcity and hunger have led to increased, albeit still sporadic, looting. The public sector's degradation has left a deep mark in peripheral regions. In its quest for hard currency, the government has set aside over 100,000 square kilometers for mining. Its lack of regulation breeds collusion among the military, criminal gangs and Colombian guerrillas. Migrants heading to Colombia must dodge competing state security forces and armed irregulars in border areas. border crossing, the poorest are left to eke out a living in a region with one of Colombia's highest unemployment rates. Malaria is again common and spreading across borders. Diseases that had been eradicated, such as measles and diphtheria, have returned. There was modest optimism at the start of talks between the government and opposition during December 2017 and January 2018. Latin American powers, concerned by the gravity of the crisis, it spread into neighboring countries, and Maduro's subversion of the rule of law with the creation of the Constituent Assembly, stepped up their involvement. The talks yielded hints of compromise, notably in the government's agreement in principle to a reform of electoral authorities and the presence of international observers as the presidential election. But the government's announcement of early polls, before any agreement on a date or conditions had been reached, in effect scuppered the talks, which ended acrimoniously with rival texts of an accord in circulation. The Lima Group, a body of 13 Latin American and Caribbean governments, plus Canada, established to find an end to Venezuela's crisis, rejected Maduro's unilateral call for elections. Despite its dismal economic record, the government occupies a strong position. The Venezuelan opposition is divided and rudderless. A sizable segment of the electorate will vote for Maduro, either out of loyalty or due to dependence on the government for food rations and other subsidized goods. The electoral authority remains under executive control, and has proven itself willing to bend the rules in the ruling party's favor and even, in one instance, seemingly to commit outright fraud. Latin American governments, together with Western and other powers, should take advantage of the strong international and regional consensus that exists on Venezuela's plight to intensify efforts to resolve the crisis. Harder-line opposition factions hope for a U.S. oil embargo or foreign intervention as a shortcut to a transition, but the dangers such actions entail in a country besieged by violence and hunger are too great to countenance. Instead, Latin American governments, together with Western and other powers, should take advantage of the strong international and regional consensus that exists on Venezuela's plight to intensify efforts to resolve the crisis. The first priority is to alleviate the human suffering. The Maduro government should accept the creation of a tripartite group proposed by humanitarian groups, comprising representatives of the Venezuelan state, civil society and specialized UN bodies, which would coordinate the provision of humanitarian assistance. Such a body should address the government's fears that allowing aid groups to deliver food would enable outside interference. The UN should work with Venezuela's neighbors to help them provide for Venezuelans leaving their country. The second priority is to revive talks between government and opposition. Ideally, the government would postpone forthcoming presidential elections, but even if the polls go ahead, the priority afterward should be a swift return to meaningful negotiations. The US, Canada and the EU have sanctioned the government, and several regional leaders are considering following suit. In themselves, such sanctions rarely prove effective. But in Venezuela's case, the threat of further sanctions, especially those imposed by Latin American governments, might improve prospects for negotiations, provided that threat was accompanied by reinvigorated diplomacy and tied to specific, realistic concessions demanded of the Maduro government. Talks should focus not only on specific electoral reforms, but on wider transitional measures, including opposition representation in key state institutions, economic reform and guarantees for top regime officials were they to eventually lose power. While past rounds have failed, negotiations between the regime and opposition, facilitated by regional or other leaders backed by concerted international pressure and aimed at establishing a more inclusive political order and restoring checks and balances, remain the only way out of the crisis. recommendations to address the humanitarian crisis stemming from the scarcity of food, medicines and other basic goods, and the consequent mass migration to neighboring countries. The Venezuelan government should facilitate the provision by international humanitarian organizations of food, medicines and other supplies vital for saving human lives, inter alia by relaxing import and exchange controls, and cease the persecution of those seeking to alleviate suffering. It should also agree to the formation of the tripartite group proposed by humanitarian organizations, comprising representatives of the state, civil society and specialized UN bodies, and having no agenda other than coordinating the provision of humanitarian assistance based on principles of strict neutrality. The UN should follow up on Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' commitment to provide assistance to Venezuela's neighbors to help them cope with the migration crisis. It should also provide clear and public information on issues such as health, welfare and social programs. Venezuela's immediate neighbors should work with multilateral bodies, particularly the UN, to ensure the needs of migrants are adequately met and those at risk of trafficking, including women and girls, are protected as best possible. Colombia should adapt its migration law and regulations governing educational and health services to eliminate bureaucratic obstacles to their provision for migrants. To help resolve the political crisis and reduce the risk of further political bloodshed, the Lima Group with the U.S. and the EU in a supporting role, should take advantage of the strong international and regional consensus that exists on the gravity of the crisis and redouble efforts to bring both sides back to the negotiating table. Those governments and organizations that have already imposed sanctions, namely, the US, Canada and the EU, could threaten to intensify those sanctions against individuals already listed, and to impose additional individual sanctions. Latin American governments in the Lima Group are considering their own sanctions. The threat, from governments in the region, of sanctions similar to those of Western powers, potentially including financial restrictions, assets freezes and travel bans on individuals, would be almost unprecedented. It could represent additional pressure on the government, which already has appeared rattled by US and EU sanctions. Any threat of sanctions must be clearly tied to realistic steps the government would need to take to avoid such measures and, potentially, have existing sanctions lifted. These would include, first, the government's return to internationally facilitated talks and might include additional measures such as releasing political prisoners and ending arbitrary bans on political leaders and parties participating in elections. Guarantees of integrity and neutrality in key electoral and judicial institutions, which would mean opposition representation in those bodies, the restoration of the powers of parliament, and measures to stabilize the economy. No foreign country should impose wide-ranging embargoes, for example on the oil industry, which would be more likely to harm the public at large than change the incentives of Venezuelan leaders. The Lima Group should encourage China, with whom many have close economic ties, to use its leverage over the Maduro government to persuade it to enter into genuine negotiations with the opposition, on the understanding that political and economic stability in Venezuela cannot be achieved by a government lacking broad popular consensus. Renewed talks between the government and opposition should focus not only on electoral reforms, but on transitional measures to include opposition representation in government institutions, economic reforms and guarantees for top officials were they to lose power in elections. All outside powers should be ready to support such a transition with financial aid, both bilateral and multilateral. Caracas, Brussels, the 21st of March 2018. Loading video. Crisis Group senior analyst Phil Gunson explains how Venezuela's socio-economic implosion is dragging in neighbors as hundreds of thousands of people flee the country, epidemics spread and violent crime spills over borders. CRISISGROUPI Introduction: Venezuela's long-running political crisis, which until recently had been treated by most foreign powers as an internal matter, has evolved into a multifaceted social and economic emergency with increasingly troubling consequences for the region. Under the rule of President Hugo Chavez (1999 to 2013), the government consolidated its grip on power, subordinating the country's nominally autonomous state institutions to the executive. This erosion of constitutional checks and balances was not only tolerated by leaders across the continent, but in some cases emulated. Over the past 5 years, however, regional and global concern over Venezuela's internal affairs has mounted. The change began with Chavez's death from cancer in early 2013 and the subsequent fall of the global oil price. External support waned under Chavez's chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, particularly after two key regional allies, Presidents Cristina Kirchner of Argentina and Dilma Rousseff of Brazil, lost power in 2015 and 2016. The election to former Uruguayan Foreign Minister Luis Almagro as Secretary-General of the Organization of American States (OAS) in 2015 also intensified regional scrutiny. Though Almagro had been elected with the votes of Venezuela and its allies, he would plot a different course from that of his predecessor José Miguel Insulza. While admitting that Venezuela was in violation of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, Insulza claimed he could do nothing without member states' support. In contrast, Almagro campaigned to hold the Maduro government accountable for what he saw as its increasingly undemocratic behavior. When, in March 2017, the Venezuelan Supreme Court voted to strip the opposition-dominated National Assembly of its powers, the OAS Permanent Council promised action under the terms of its democratic charter. But regional pressure has neither checked the Maduro government's authoritarianism nor remedied the economic problems that underlie a deepening humanitarian disaster. Other Latin American countries are now buffeted by shock waves emanating from a country in the grip of hyperinflation and chronically deteriorating living conditions. Based on field research in Caracas, on the Venezuela-Colombia border and in the mining districts of the Bolívar and Amazonas states, this report examines the latest twists of the Venezuelan crisis and their impact on the region. It outlines how major and regional powers might respond to help minimize violence and suffering, and create the conditions for a restoration of economic health and a more inclusive and stable body politic in Venezuela. 2. Disappearing checks and balances. Over nearly 2 decades in power, the self-styled Bolivarian revolutionary government in Venezuela has packed the Supreme Court, the electoral authority and other branches of state with supporters ever more unconditional in their loyalty, thereby eroding checks and balances. The process has intensified greatly in the past 3 years. Following out of the public sector has left the rule of law in tatters, as the dissident Attorney General acknowledged weeks before heading into exile in August 2017. Under Chavez, when the oil price was high, the government could win elections without overt fraud, although the playing field was heavily tilted in its favor. The first parliamentary elections under President Maduro, in December 2015, saw the opposition Democratic Unity (MUD) coalition win 2/3 of seats, posing an unprecedented challenge to the government and forcing a recalibration of its means of political survival. The government subsequently used a series of legalistic subterfuges to render the National Assembly impotent. It blocked an opposition attempt to trigger a recall referendum against Maduro and suspended signed regional and local elections that should have been held in 2016. In late October that year, the Vatican sought to broker negotiations between government and opposition, which collapsed after a few weeks amid mutual recriminations. When the Supreme Court moved to assume all functions of the Assembly the following year, the MUD announced it would mount mass demonstrations in a bid to force the government to honor commitments it had made during the negotiations. The protests, which took place across the country several times per week for 4 months, left over 125 people dead and thousands more injured and imprisoned, amid widespread allegations of torture and excessive use of force by security officers. The protests petered out after the government held elections for a National Constituent Assembly, purportedly in order to reform the 1999 Constitution. The MUD boycotted the contest on the grounds that Maduro had called it without consulting the electorate, and that the voting system had been manipulated to give the government an automatic majority. On the 16th of July, the opposition-dominated National Assembly organized an unofficial referendum in which opposition leaders claimed more than 7 million people participated. Well over 90% of those who voted rejected the Constituent Assembly elections and backed the renovation of state institutions and the creation of a national unity government. Talks between senior MUD leaders and representatives of Maduro failed to bring the two sides together. This unofficial vote failed to halt the Constituent Assembly elections. Talks between senior MUD leaders and representatives of Maduro, in which former Spanish Prime Minister José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero played a role, failed to bring the two sides together. On 30th of July, the vote saw 545 pro-government representatives elected to the Constituent Assembly. The government claimed that over 8 million votes had been cast. Detailed results were never published, however. The Smartmatic company responsible for the election software estimated that the true number was, at least 1 million, fewer. Other sources cited still lower figures. With neither opposition witnesses nor independent observers at the polls, the real turnout was impossible to gauge. The Constituent Assembly, which according to the government has supra-constitutional powers and authority over all existing institutions, soon proved an asset in the government's bid for control. The Assembly called regional elections for October, and electoral authorities instructed political parties to register their candidates within 48 hours, later refusing to remove from the ballot those who lost subsequent MUD primaries. This maneuver led to many invalid votes being cast, but it was only one of a series of irregularities that, according to one national election observation group, made it impossible to consider the result a faithful expression of the citizens' will. Official tallies gave 18 of the 23 states to the ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, on a 61% turnout, inverting the predictions of most polling organizations. The reasons for the opposition's defeat remain a matter of debate, but in essence the government maximized its own vote, in part by apparent coercion and vote buying, while many previous MUD supporters stayed at home. In particular, the explicit linkage of a government identity card, known as the Carnet de la Patria, to the provision of subsidized food handouts and other social benefits, as well as to the voting process, made many fearful that a vote against the ruling party could cost them benefits. In the southeastern state of Bolívar, the result took days to announce, and for the first time in the Chavista era, clear evidence emerged that the electoral authorities' electronic count did not match the number of votes registered on paper tally sheets provided by voting machines. In other words, authorities appear to have altered the result, transforming a narrow opposition victory into a slimmer win for the government candidate. Protests were to no avail, and the electoral authority declined even to respond to a formal opposition challenge. Many fear, that a vote against the ruling party could cost them benefits. Bolstered by victory in regional elections, the Maduro government moved promptly to schedule long-delayed mayoral elections for the 10th of December. Most major opposition parties boycotted the poll, and the government won 308 of the 335 town halls at stake. This series of defeats for the opposition brought its popularity and cohesion to their lowest ebb. the decision by the leaders of the biggest four parties in the mud, the so-called G4, to enter fresh negotiations with the government, in a bid to obtain better conditions for a presidential election due in 2018 led to bitter accusations from other opposition leaders that they intended to negotiate a form of cohabitation with the government. In late November, a group of politicians opposed to what they saw as the MUD's betrayal of the mandate from the 16th of July plebiscite broke away to launch Soy Venezuela, a movement formally committed to restoring the republic as soon as possible. Soy Venezuela opposes negotiations between the government and opposition, unless talks are preceded by the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and the release of all political prisoners, and focus exclusively on terms for the government's removal. Its most visible leaders are Maria Corina Machado of Venezuela, the exiled former mayor of metropolitan Caracas Antonio Ledesma, and Diego Aria, a former Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations resident in New York. They have received some international support for their stance, notably from OAS Secretary-General Almagro. 3. The economic impact. Once the richest economy in Latin America, Venezuela has suffered a precipitous economic decline under President Maduro. Strangled by rigid price and exchange controls, the economy has shrunk by over one-third since 2012, while inflation has begun to climb almost vertically. Corrupt and inefficient state-run companies swallow resources while producing little of value. Most individuals and businesses have no means of obtaining hard currency, while a default of Venezuela's foreign debt appears ever more likely. Trade is diminished, affecting other Latin American economies. Some, including Colombia and Brazil, had seen exports to Venezuela rise sharply during the 2003 to 2013 oil boom, only to watch them collapse as the recession bit. Others benefited from energy subsidies the government can no longer afford to maintain at previous levels, partly because of plunging oil production. The central bank stopped publishing GDP and inflation figures some time ago, but according to the Finance Commission of the opposition-led National Assembly, the monthly rate passed the 50% mark, conventionally regarded as the threshold of hyperinflation, in October 2017. The opposition puts accumulated inflation for 2017 at 2,616%. The International Monetary Fund projects 2018 inflation of 13,000%, although some estimates are even higher. Despite half a dozen increases in the minimum wage in 12 months, by January 2018 its purchasing power had fallen to a fifth of its value over that time. In the same period, oil production, which accounts for almost all export earnings, fell by 29%. Venezuela is on the brink of a major default on its foreign debt, which would be the first in the region since the Argentine debt crisis of 2001. In early November 2017, President Maduro announced that he would seek to restructure and refinance the country's debt and invited bondholders to a meeting in Caracas. But he has put forward no plan and negotiations have not begun. The chances of an orderly restructuring are closed until, because U.S. sanctions in place since mid-2017 make it an offense under U.S. law to loan money to the Venezuelan government or to Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, the state oil company, except under certain, highly limited circumstances. Venezuela is on the brink of a major default on its foreign debt, which would be the first in the region since the Argentine debt crisis.